Hey, my reactors. Wait a minute, y'all. I'm on chapter 8 of the store. Okay. Margaret Whalen wanted me. She was thin and pale and weak and older than her years. Her beauty had gone to a kind of fragile look. As I was reintroduced to her, she sipped at her little bottle of dark brown reddish liquid and smiled. Nigel carried her up to her room. She could walk a little, but she couldn't manage the stairs. Sometime later, she wanted to see Nigel's children. She was sugary sweet with them. I couldn't remember her being that way with anyone but Rufus before. Slave children hadn't interested her unless her husband had fathered them. Then her interest had been negative. But she gave Nigel's son candy, and they loved her. She asked to see another slave, one I didn't know, and then wept a little when she heard that one has been sold. She was full of sweetness and charity. It scared me a little. I couldn't quite believe she changed that much. Dana, can you still read the way you used to? She asked me. Yes, ma'am. I wanted you because I remember how well you read. I kept my expression neutral. If she didn't remember what she had thought of my reading, I did. Read the Bible to me, she said. Now, she had just had her breakfast. I hadn't had anything yet, and I was hungry. Now, yes, read the Sermon on the Mount. That was the beginning of my first full day with her. When she was tired of hearing me read, she thought of other things for me to do. Her laundry, for instance. She wouldn't trust anyone else to do it. I wondered whether she had already found out that Alice generally did the laundry, and there was cleaner. She didn't believe her room had been swept and dust until she saw me do it. She didn't believe Sarah understood how she wanted dinner prepared until I went down, got Sarah, and brought her back with me to receive instructions. She had to talk to Curry. She had to talk to Curry and Nigel about the cleaning. She had to inspect the boy and girl who served at the table. In short, she had to prove that she was running her own house again. And it had gone along without her for years, but she was back now. She decided to teach me to sew. I had an old sink at home, and I could sew well enough with it too to take care of my needs and Kevin's. But I thought sewing by hand, especially sewing for pleasure, was slow torture. Margaret Whalen never asked me whether I wanted to learn, though. She had time to feel, and it was my job to help her feel it. So I spent long, tedious hours trying to imitate her tiny, straight, even stitches, and she spent minutes ripping out my work and lecturing me none too gently on how bad it was. As the days passed, I learned to take longer than necessary when she sent me for an errand. I learned to tell lies to get away from her when I thought I was about to explode. I learned to listen silently while she talked and talked and talked, mostly about how much better things were in Baltimore than here. I never learned to like sleeping on the floor of her room, but she wouldn't permit the trundle bed to be brought in. She honestly didn't see that it was any harsher for me to sleep on the floor. Niggas always slept on the floor. Troublesome as she was, though, Margaret Whalen had mellowed. She didn't have the old burst of temper anymore. Maybe it was because of the sickness. "You're a good girl," she said to me once as I sat near her bed, stitching at a slip cover. "Much better than you used to be. Someone must have taught you to behave." "Yes, ma'am, I didn't even look up." "Good. You were impudent before. There's nothing worse than that impudent nigger." "Yes, ma'am." She depressed me, bored me, angered me. drove me crazy, but my back healed completely while I was with her. The work wasn't hard, and she never complained about anything but my sewing. She never threatened me to or tried to have me whipped. Rufus said she was pleased with me. That seemed to surprise even him, so I endured her quietly. By now, I knew enough to realize when I was well off, or I thought I did. You ought to see yourself, Alice told me one day as I was hiding out in her cabin. The cabin Rufus had Nigel built her just before the birth of her first child. What do you mean? I asked. Mr. Rufus really put the fear of God in you, didn't he? Fear? What are you talking about? You run around fetching and caring for that woman like you love her, and half a day in the field was all it took. Hell, Alice, leave me alone. I've been listening to nonsense all morning. I don't need yours. You don't want to hear me. Get out of here. The way you always sucking up to that woman is enough to make anybody sick. I got up and went to the cookhouse. There were times when it was stupid to expect reasons from Alice. Times when it did no good to point out. I know y'all. They said I go on 8. Okay. To point out the obvious. There were 2 field hands in the cookhouse. One young man who had a broken leg splintered and obviously healing crooked, and one old man who didn't do much work anymore. I could hear them before I went in. I know Mr. Rufus will get rid of me if he can, said the young man. I ain't no good to him. His daddy would have got rid of me. Won't nobody buy me, said the old man. I was burnt out a long time ago. It's you young ones got to worry. I went into the cookout, and the young man who had his mouth open to speak closed it quickly, looking at me with open hostility. The old man simply turned his back. I seen slaves do that to Alice. I hadn't noticed them doing it to me before. Suddenly, the cookhouse was no more comfortable than Alice's cabin had been. It might have been different if Sir or Curry had been there, but they weren't. I left the cookhouse and went back towards the main house, feeling lonely. Once I was inside, though, I wondered why I had crept away like that. Why hadn't I fought back? Alice accusing me was ridiculous, and she knew it. But the field hands, they just didn't know me. Didn't know how loyal I might be to Rufus or Margaret. Didn't know what I might report. And if I told them, how likely would they be to believe me? But still, I went down the hall and towards the stairs slowly, wondering why I hadn't tried to defend myself, at least tried. Was I getting so used to being submissive? Upstairs, I could hear Margaret Whalen thumping on the floor with her cane. She didn't use the cane much for walking because she hardly ever walked. She used it to call me. I turned and went back out of the house, out towards the woods. I had to think. I wasn't getting enough time to myself once. God knows how long. I had worried that I was keeping too much distance between myself and the alien time. Now there was no distance at all. When had I stopped acting? Why had I stopped? There were people coming towards me through the woods. Several people. They were on a road, and I was several feet off it. I crouched in the trees to wait for them to pass. I was in no mood to answer some white man's stupid, inevitable questions. What are you doing here? Who's your master? I could have answered without any troubles. I was nowhere near the edge of Wayland Land, but just for a while, I wanted to be my own master before I forgot what it felt like. A white man went by on a horseback, leading 24 black men chained 2 by 2. Chained. They wore handcuffs and iron collars with chains connecting the collars to a central chain that ran between the 2 lines. Behind the men walked several women roped together neck to neck, a coffle, slaves for sale. At the end of the procession rode a second white man with a gun in his hand. They were all headed for the wedding's house. I realized suddenly that the slaves in the cookout had not been speculating idly about the possibility of being sold. They had known that there was a sale coming. Field hands who never set foot in the main house, and they had known. I hadn't heard a thing. Lately, Rufus spent this time either straightening out his father's affairs or sleeping. The weakness left over from his illness was still with him, and he had no time for me. He barely had time for his mother, but he had time to sell slaves. He had time to make himself that much more like his father. I let the Kofu reach the house far ahead of me. By the time I got there, 3 slaves were already being added to the line. 2 men, 1 grim-faced, 1 openly weeping, and 1 woman who moved as though she was sleepwalking. As I got closer, the woman began to look familiar to me. I stopped, almost not wanting to know who it was. A tall, strongly built, handsome woman. Tess. I've seen her only 2 or 3 times this trip. She was still working in the fields, still serving the overseer at night. She had no children, and that may have been why she was being sold. Or maybe this was something Marvin Wade had arranged. She might be that vindictive if she knew of her husband's temporary interest in Tess. I started towards Tess and the white man who had just tied a rope around her neck, fastening her into the line. Saw me. He turned to face me, gun drawn. I stopped, alarmed, confused. I had made no threatening move. I just wanted to say goodbye to my friend. I told him. I was whispering for some reason. Say it from here. She can hear you. Tess. She stood head down, shoulders rounded, a little red bundle hanging from one hand. She should have heard me, but I didn't think she had. Tess, it's Dana. She never looked up. Dana? Dana, Rufus' voice from near the steps where he was talking with the other white man. You get away from here. Go inside. Tess, I called once more, willing her to answer. She knew my voice surely. Why wouldn't she look up? Why wouldn't she speak? Why wouldn't she even move? It was as though I didn't exist for her, and as though I wasn't real. I stepped towards her. I think I would have gone to her, taken the rope from her neck, or gotten shot trying. But at that moment, Rufus reached me. He grabbed me, hustled me into the house, into the library. Stay here, he ordered. Just stay. He stopped, suddenly stumbled against me, clutching at me now, not to hold me where I was, but to keep himself upright. Damn. How could you do that? I hissed at him as he straightened. Tess, those others, they're my property. I stared at him in disbelief. Oh my God. He passed a hand over his face. Okay. He passed a hand over his face, turned away. Look, this sale is something my father arranged before he died. You can't do anything about it, so just stay out the way. Or what? You gonna tell me to? You might as well. He went back outside without answering. After a while, I sat down in Tom Waiting warm armchair and put my head down on the desk. So y'all, that's it for chapter 7. I'll be back with chapter 8. Bye, my reactors.